Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for the kind introductions. Also, thank you to Corinna for making this happen. It's a real pleasure to be here at Union to discuss my new book, One Nation Under God. And in a lot of ways, it's fitting. One of the main figures in my book is Dwight D. Eisenhower. And just a few years before he became president of the United States, he served as president of Columbia University across the street. But in many ways, I think Eisenhower would have rather been president here instead. In an interview before he just started at Columbia, he declared himself proudly to be, quote, the most intensely religious man I've ever met. Although we don't think of him that way, Eisenhower came from a deeply devout background. His grandfather was a minister for the River Brethren, an offshoot of the Mennonites, and his father maintained that faith. His mother traveled a more winding religious route. Born and raised a Lutheran, she joined the River Brethren at marriage, was later baptized as a Jehovah's Witness when Dwight was 8 years old. While the denominations varied, the family's commitment to a literal reading of the Bible remained constant and a constant presence in their children's lives. As one of Dwight's brothers later explained, all of the Eisenhowers are fundamentalists. Dwight Eisenhower carried his family's religious faith. There we go. Thank you. How's that? Dwight Eisenhower carried his family's religious faith with him into politics. His acceptance speech of a 1952 Republican National Convention, the presidential nominee promised that the coming campaign would be, quote, a great crusade for freedom. As he traveled across America that summer, Eisenhower gave speech after speech filled with religious references. The scripture he routinely cited on the stump had been recommended to him by the Reverend Billy Graham, a good friend and a spiritual advisor with whom he stayed in close contact throughout the campaign. Eisenhower spoke about spirituality so much on the stump that a New York Times reporter likened his campaign to, quote, William Jennings Bryan's invasion of the Bible Belt during the Chautauqua Circuit days. When he won in a landslide, Eisenhower saw a mandate for a national religious revival in the election returns. I think one of the reasons I was elected was to help lead this country spiritually, he told Billy Graham. We need spiritual renewal. Eisenhower's inauguration set the tone for his new administration. And in many ways, the inauguration was much more than a political ceremony. It was instead a religious consecration. Some Republicans wanted to make it officially a national day of prayer. But even without Congress's blessing, the day bore all the markings of one. Traditionally, incoming presidents attended religious services on the morning of their inauguration, but usually discreetly. Harry Truman had snuck into St. John's Episcopal the morning of his inauguration, surprising local parishioners. Eisenhower instead turned spirituality into a spectacle. At a transition meeting with his cabinet, he announced that they and their families were invited to a special religious service at National Presbyterian Church the morning of the inauguration. Chief of Staff Sherman Adams remembered, quote, he added hastily as an afterthought that, of course, no cabinet member should feel under pressure to go to the Presbyterian services. Anybody could go instead to a church of his own choosing. Given a choice, though, between worshiping with the president and without him, almost all chose the former. More than 150 supporters joined the extended Eisenhower clan for the services. The event had been publicized widely in the press, so the attendees arrived to find a packed church with 800 more onlookers waiting outside in the morning chill. This religious service was repeated across Washington as countless churches and synagogues devoted themselves to prayers for the president. St. John Episcopal had services every hour on the hour. The Washington Post noted that even the city's first mosque, then still under construction, was, quote, open for all Muslims who wish to invoke Allah's aid for the Republican administration. Public prayer dominated the actual inauguration, too. Chief Justice Fred Vinson, who was on hand to deliver the oath of office, appreciated this religious emphasis. When he'd been appointed to the Supreme Court a few years earlier, Vinson had taken part in a quote-unquote consecration ceremony sponsored by a prayer breakfast group in the Senate. At that ceremony, the new Chief Justice testified to, quote, the importance of the Bible being the book of all the people and how the whole superstructure of our government and jurisprudence is built upon it. And now he beamed with pride as the president essentially said the same. As Vinson delivered the oath of office, Eisenhower's left hand rested not on one Bible, but on two. Each was open to a passage recommended by Billy Graham. A black family Bible was open to 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Graham had repeatedly cited that verse to during his crusade revivals across the country as a sign that God demanded America repent. And now Eisenhower did the same. The Second Bible, a Masonic version that had been used by George Washington at the very first inauguration, was positioned to a similar passage in Psalm 127. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. Immediately after Eisenhower took his oath, in his very first official words as president, he called the country to prayer. He asked the 125,000 Americans in attendance and the estimated 70 million more watching at home on television to bow their heads so he might lead them in, quote, a little private prayer of my own that he had written that morning. The language was a little clunky, but the spirit was sincere. Almighty God, he began, as we stand here at this moment, my future associates in the executive branch of government, join me in beseeching that thou will make full and complete our dedication to the service of the people in this throng and their fellow citizens everywhere. The president's prayer caused a minor sensation, not because of anything said in it, but simply because it had been said. A half mile from the Capitol ceremonies, crowds along Pennsylvania Avenue listened as the prayer came crackling out of portable speakers strung along the streets. There was an electric something, an observer noted, that seemed to summon the waiting multitude to their knees. An instant sensation, the inaugural prayer, was quickly reproduced in countless newspapers and magazines. An oilman from Shreveport printed it up as a pamphlet he widely distributed. It had a photo of the president on the left, the American flag on the right, and the cross overhead. At the bottom ran a prayer of the oilman's own. God save our president who saved our country and our world. Eisenhower's inaugural address, meanwhile, was likewise filled with references for the faith of the president and the people he now sought to lead to revival. We who are free must proclaim anew our faith, he insisted. This faith is the abiding creed of our fathers. This is the faith of the deathless dignity of man, governed by eternal moral and natural laws. After the speech was over, the president and his family watched the inaugural parade. For most observers, the most significant part of the parade was the very first float. Called God's Float by its creators, it featured a replica of a house of worship at its center, with giant photographs of churches and synagogues arrayed alongside. Two phrases appeared in Gothic script at each end: freedom of worship and in God we trust. These religious themes of the inauguration were replayed repeatedly in the early weeks of the administration. The first week of February 1953 alone was exceptionally busy, but it purposely established the tenor and tone of the entire presidency. On Sunday morning, Eisenhower became the first president ever to be baptized while in office, taking the rite of a national Presbyterian congregation. The very same night, the president delivered an Oval Office address for the American Legion's new Back to God campaign, urging millions watching and listening to acknowledge that America had a spiritual foundation. 4 days later, he was a guest of honor at the very first National Prayer Breakfast. Now an annual tradition, the inaugural event was hosted by hotel magnate Conrad Hilton, with a crowd of more than 500 dignitaries, including several senators, representatives, cabinet ministers, ambassadors, and justices of the Supreme Court. Fittingly, the theme was government under God. The convening pastor led a, quote, prayer of consecration for the new president before Eisenhower offered some brief remarks of his own. The very basis of our government is we hold that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain rights, the president reflected. In one sentence, we establish that every free government is embedded soundly in a deeply felt religious faith, or it makes no sense. Eisenhower made clear that he would personally turn those words to deeds, instituting the first ever opening prayers at a cabinet meeting the very next day. The president seemed sincere, but it took some time before this became a natural habit. His secretary recalled once when Eisenhower left a cabinet meeting, only to slap his forehead and exclaim, "Jesus Christ, we forgot the prayer." All of that activity took place in just the first week of February 1953. In the months and years that followed, the new president led the nation on a massive religious revival that was nothing short of revolutionary. A few months later, for instance, President Eisenhower, Vice President Nixon, and the members of their cabinet held a formal signing ceremony in the Oval Office that formally declared that the United States of America was based on biblical principles found in the 23rd Psalm. Official programs of prayer swept through countless executive departments, including the Pentagon, the State Department, the USDA, and others. The rest of the Capitol quickly consecrated itself as well. In 1954, Congress followed Eisenhower's lead by formally adding the phrase "under God" to the previously secular Pledge of Allegiance. A similar phrase, "In God We Trust," was added to a postage stamp for the first time that year, then to paper money the following year. In 1956, it became the nation's first official motto. During these revolutionary years, Americans were told time and time again that the nation not only should be a Christian nation, but that it had in fact always been one. They soon came to believe that the United States of America was, quote, one nation under God. They believed it ever since. Now at heart, my book seeks to challenge Americans' assumptions about the basic relationship between religion and politics in their nation's history. For decades now, as I'm sure you know, liberals and conservatives have been locked in a seemingly endless struggle over an apparently simple question: is the United States a Christian nation? This debate, largely focused on endless parsing and reparsing of the words of the Founding Fathers, has ultimately generated more heat than light. Like most scholars, I believe the historical record is fairly clear about the founding generation's preference for what Thomas Jefferson memorably called a wall of separation between church and state. I believe they spelled out repeatedly in public statements and private correspondence. But I also know that this academic consensus has done little to shift popular opinion. If anything, the country has more tightly embraced religion in the public sphere and in political culture in recent decades. Accordingly, my book begins with a different premise. It sets aside the question of whether or not the founders intended America to be a Christian nation, and instead asks why and when so many contemporary Americans came to believe that the country was, has been, and always in fact should be a Christian nation. As the story of the early months of the Eisenhower administration makes clear, part of the answer, but not all of it, but part of it, lies in the 1950s, when Americans underwent a revolution in how they understood the role of religion in public life. Other historians before me have paid attention to the establishment of these new religious mottos and ceremonies in these years, but they've all misplaced the origins. Without exception, works that deal with this religious revival in the Eisenhower era attribute the rise of public religion solely to the Cold War. According to this conventional wisdom, as the United States fell under the thrall of the anti-communist panic of the McCarthy years, its leaders suddenly sought to emphasize the nation's religious traits as a means of distinguishing America from the, quote, godless communist of the Soviet Union. But as my book shows, the post-war revolution in America's religious identity had its roots not in the foreign policy panic of the 1950s, but rather in the domestic politics of the 1930s and 1940s. Decades before the inaugural prayers of Dwight Eisenhower, corporate titans enlisted conservative clergymen to promote a new political argument embodied in the phrase, freedom under God. And as their private correspondence and public claims make clear, this new ideology was designed to defeat the state power that its architects feared most. And it wasn't the Soviet regime in Moscow, it was the New Deal administration in Washington. With ample funding from major corporations and prominent industrialists, conservative clergy and their allies in the 1930s and 1940s advanced a new ideology that was best characterized as Christian libertarianism. In an impressive array of newspapers, magazines, radio programs, television specials, sermons, and massive public events, these new evangelists for free enterprise argued that the New Deal was a program of what they called pagan statism. Specifically, they argued that the New Deal violated the Ten Commandments. The Roosevelt administration, they said, had made a false idol of the federal government, leading Americans to worship it rather than the Almighty. It caused Americans to covet what the wealthy possessed and sought to steal from them through the redistribution of their wealth with taxes and the regulation of their private enterprises. And ultimately, it bore false witness by making wild promises for security that it could never bring about. Above all, these Christian libertarians insisted that the welfare state was not a means to implement Jesus' teachings about caring for the poor and the needy, but rather a corruption of his doctrine. In a forceful rejection of the public service themes of the social gospel, they argued that the central tenet of Christianity remained the salvation of the individual. If any political and economic system fit with the religious teachings of Christ, it would have to be a system rooted in a similarly individualistic ethos. Nothing better exemplified such values, they argued, than the capitalist system of free enterprise. In both systems, individuals rose or fell according to their own merits, and any system that meddled in that divine order was pagan. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, this message of freedom under God was being publicized by religious leaders like Norman Vincent Peale, Billy Graham, Abraham Vereday. It was promoted by conservative icons ranging from former President Herbert Hoover to future President Ronald Reagan. This new conflation of faith, freedom, and free enterprise then moved to center stage in the 1950s under the watch of another Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower. Although the acts of the Eisenhower administration were transformative, the changes it pushed through in the public sphere essentially echoed and amplified the work of countless private organizations and ordinary citizens who had long been active in this cause. Corporate leaders remained central here. Leading industrialists and major business organizations bankrolled major efforts to promote the role of religion in public life. The top advertising agency of the era, the J. Walter Thompson Company, urged Americans to attend churches and synagogues through an unprecedented Religion in American Life ad campaign. Even Hollywood got into the act, with director Cecil B. DeMille helping erect literally thousands of granite monuments to the Ten Commandments across the nation as part of what was a promotional campaign for the movie of the same name. Inundated with urgent calls to embrace faith, Americans did just that. The percentage of Americans who had claimed membership in a church or synagogue had been fairly low across the 19th century, though it had slowly increased from about 16% in 1850 to 36% in 1900. In the early decades of the 20th century, the percentages plateaued, remaining at 43% in 1910 and 1920, then barely creeping up to 47% in 1930, 49% in 1940. In the decade and a half after the Second World War, however, the percentage of Americans who belonged to a church or synagogue skyrocketed. It reached 57% in 1950. It then peaked at 69% at the end of the decade, an all-time high. Now, while the Eisenhower administration was pivotal in bringing about these changes, it was pivotal in another sense as well. Eisenhower was certainly sympathetic to these campaigns of Christian libertarians, and he had been active in many of the organizations that drove this ideology. But where those forces that had always seen this public religiosity as a means to a partisan ends, rolling back the New Deal, Eisenhower saw the new politics of piety and patriotism as an end into itself. Uncoupling their cause from its starkly partisan roots, he succeeded in bringing together a wide array of Americans, Catholics and Jews, as well as Protestants, liberals and moderates, as well as conservatives. Under his watch, Americans who otherwise differed in their politics, religion, and race came to agree, if only briefly, that the country they held in common was in fact one nation under God. Indeed, as remarkable as this religious revival was, what I find even more remarkable was that there was so little opposition to it. A few clergymen complained that this public faith was a little shallow, but they ultimately approved of anything that got people into their churches. In political terms, both parties welcomed the popular new drive to link piety and patriotism. The only thing they fought over, in fact, was who deserved more credit. Legal scholars likewise claimed that there was nothing to fear in these changes. They argued that the adoption of mottos like "One Nation Under God" and "In God We Trust" did not impact America's commitment to the separation of church and state. Such acts of, quote, ceremonial deism were, in the memorable words of Yale Law School Dean Eugene Rostow, they were just harmless ornamentation. It was, quote, so conventional and uncontroversial as to be constitutional. The Supreme Court sanctioned most of these changes too. Even the outspokenly liberal Justice William O. Douglas concluded in 1952 that public invocations of faith were ironclad proof that Americans were, quote, a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being. In 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren agreed, "We are a Christian nation." Even the civil liberties organizations that we might today assume would have raised some objection or opposition did nothing, at least at first. The American Civil Liberties Union, for instance, the ACLU, was focused on the menace of McCarthyism, and they paid little attention to the new religious rhetoric and rituals of the Eisenhower era. Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, the most significant organization of its kind, was likewise focused elsewhere. As suggested by its original name, still in use in that decade, Protestants and Other Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, it worried more about Catholics seeking public support for parochial schools. In general, these civil liberties groups accepted the then common claim that the First Amendment mandated the separation of church and state, but not the separation of religion and politics. They believed government support for a specific sect was wrong, but an embrace of the generically sacred was fine. Ultimately, then, the present-day assumptions of conservative Christians do rest on a foundation of fact. There once was a time in which virtually all Americans agreed that the country was a Christian nation, or in their more expansive moments, a Judeo-Christian nation. To be sure, that period of consensus was much more recent and much more short-lived than many assume, but it did exist all the same. It wasn't a myth. And importantly, during that brief moment, this new public religiosity succeeded in writing itself, quite literally in some cases, writing itself into the very identity of the nation. It transformed the national motto and rewrote the Pledge of Allegiance. It became a central part of important ceremonies of civic life and invented wholly new traditions of its own. It altered the course of American politics at the highest levels and transformed how ordinary citizens understood their country. That consensus of the Eisenhower years, though, was short-lived. As the religious revival moved from the national level to the local, it became a problem. At the national level, a vaguely defined ceremonial deism had held sway. At the local, though, that wouldn't hold. This was especially true when it came to local schools. As individual schools and districts embraced this public religion, it took on new forms that were once more concrete and more controversial. Educators at the state and local level required religious programs to be as detailed as the rest of their curricula. And as a result, they soon found themselves involved in controversies that national leaders had always managed to avoid. While leaders in political and popular culture had encouraged a return to prayer in general, state-level administrators felt the need to choose or to write specific prayers for all school children to use. Likewise, while religious leaders had encouraged Americans to pick up their Bibles, local educators had to assign a particular version, invariably offending one sect or another. And so as they tried to channel this very vague religion from the national level to the local, school officials across the country sparked local controversies that in turn had national ramifications. Major controversies over school prayer in the 1960s, which unfolded first in the Supreme Court and then in Congress, demonstrated that the symbols and slogans of the Eisenhower era, instituted less than a decade earlier, had quickly been embraced by many Americans as ironclad evidence of the nation's religious roots. As conservatives fought to restore school prayer and to roll back the social changes of the turbulent 60s, they rallied around phrases like one nation under God. As a result, the religious rhetoric that had recently been used to unite Americans began to drive them further apart. And at decade's end, Richard Nixon helped complete this polarization of the nation's public religion. He used it to advance divisive policies at both home and abroad. Nixon held church services inside the White House in the East Room, using a set of hand-picked preachers to deliver pre-approved messages to congregations full of congressmen and other people he was seeking to lobby on silent majority issues. At the same time, Nixon enlisted Billy Graham to hold a series of massive religious revivals that were meant to deflect criticism of the widening war in Vietnam, including a giant Honor America Day program held on a national mall on the 4th of July in 1970. As Nixon used the rhetoric of piety and patriotism for his own political ends, the language that had once brought Americans together only drove them further apart. By the dawn of the 1970s, this language was largely seen by all sides as something that belonged to the right alone. In the end, my book seeks to recover an important history that I think has remained lost in plain sight. Over the middle decades of the 20th century, phrases like one nation under God and in God we trust, so seemingly simple and yet actually quite complex, became common themes in the identity of modern America. To this day, these expressions remain etched across our lives. They are written into the Pledge of Patriotism our children say each morning. They are marked on the money we carry in our wallets. They're carved into the walls of our courts and our Congress. These are everyday things, and like everyday things, they're often overlooked. But they speak to who we are as a people, or at least who we think we might be, or perhaps should be. And it's time, I think, we stop taking them for granted. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. I want to kind of open up the conversation, and we'll begin to have an opportunity for you to ask questions. But I want to begin by asking you a question, Kevin. You identify the Reverend James Fifield as one of the first Christian leaders to make this alliance with the industrialists, and he becomes the founder of the spiritual mobilization, right? Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about who this clergy were. Where did they come from? What were they like?
Fifield's a great example. Fifield is James W. Fifield, Jr. is the minister of First Congregational Church in Los Angeles, in Beverly Hills. He is literally preaching to a congregation of millionaires. The richest and most powerful people in Los Angeles are members of this church. He not surprisingly tells them what they want to hear, which is that it's God's favor that they've gotten wealthy. He is politically conservative, doctrinally liberal. He says in one of his books, reading the Bible is like eating fish. We take the bones out to enjoy the meat. All parts are not of equal value. So he writes off all of Christ's teachings about poverty and charity, exactly, and his warnings about the dangers of wealth, and instead he reads his own interpretation into it. He quickly answers the call when industrialists start looking for someone to preach this message. And they're looking for it because they tried to preach the message that capitalism was godly on their own, and no one was buying. There's a group called the American Liberty League, which gains fame in the 1930s. It spends millions of dollars trying to promote free enterprise. But it's pretty obviously dismissed as a group of businessmen looking out for business. Jim Farley of the Democratic Party famously says, they ought to call it the American Cellophane League, because number one, it's a DuPont product, and number two, you can see right through it. Instead, they realize, and they talk about this in the private letters, that if we're going to outsource this job, they're very clear about this, we should get ministers to do it. Because polls show ministers are the most trusted people in America. And if you put our message in their mouths, people will finally start accepting it. Fifield quickly answers the call. He has powerful businessmen in his audience, people like Cecil B. DeMille, but also the future head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is there, a number of others. And they connect him to a national set of businessmen who very quickly funnel massive amounts of money into his organization to help him promote this message.
And it grows.
Oh, it absolutely grows. He very quickly really starts going nationally in the mid-1940s when he gets this project bankrolled. By the early 1950s, he has 17,000 minister representatives, which is about 10% of all ministers in the country, are members of his organization.
Right. Now, I understand, when you talk about ministers were the most trusted men in the U.S., that's how they were seen. But surely that's no longer the case with all of the things that have been happening with mainline denominations and all that. So I want to ask you, what role does the clergy, do you see any kind of these Fifield-like people that are out there in some way still advocating that, perhaps in a different way, in a different language, different organizations, but what role are clergy playing in this now?
In today?
If any role at all.
Well, I'm an historian. I specialize in hindsight, but I'll speculate a little bit. I mean, I think you can look at people who are kind of representing the prosperity gospel today. I think Joel Osteen is preaching the same message. It's got a slightly different context now, I think because of the politics have changed.
Right.
Fifield was very much pushing libertarian arguments because the country had accepted the regulatory state. But we live in the wake of Reagan, in which those arguments are kind of out there, and Osteen doesn't have to push those, and he can instead do more of a traditional blending of capitalism and Christianity. Okay.
Let me ask you about Billy Graham, because he plays a very prominent role, not just, for many presidents.
Right.
Tell me about, what does it mean for him to be the confidant of the presidents and the religious advisor for these men?
It means a great deal. Billy Graham comes on the national scene in late 1949, and he does so, we often forget, there are many powerful preachers at the time. He gains fame largely because he has a number of powerful backers. Sid Richardson, an oil man who's perhaps the country's wealthiest man at the time, becomes his patron. Media figures like Henry Luce at time back him. William Randolph Hearst sends out a 2-word telegram to all of his newspapers that says, "Puff Graham, build him up." The politics doesn't come as easy because the president of the time is Harry Truman. And Harry Truman is a traditional Baptist this time. He's someone who, he quotes Matthew all the time. He does not believe in public shows of prayer. He's a go-in-your-closet kind of guy. He writes this in his diary, in fact. And Graham comes to him, and Graham is quite different. And Graham's own admission is that when they go to visit Truman, and Truman had held off against this until finally a Democratic politician twists his arm and makes him say yes, because Graham is getting popular across the country. It'll be good for the party. So they meet with Truman in the White House, And by Graham's own admission, they looked like, he said, a traveling vaudeville team. They had kind of brightly colored suits and white suede shoes, and they go in and they make a big show. Graham asks if he can pray with the president, and in a ringing endorsement, Harry Truman says, "Well, I guess it can't hurt." And he grabs Truman by the shoulder really tight, and Truman's a little guy and Graham's huge. Grabs him by the shoulder really tight, and as he's singing a prayer, one of his associates is punctuating it with "Amen, tell it," and you can just tell Truman is not into this at all. And then worst of all, they pose for photographs on the lawn of the White House. Truman bans them from ever coming back. Eisenhower's rather different, though. Eisenhower meets with Billy Graham early on, and he does so for one reason: is Eisenhower's main patron at the time is the same oil man, Sid Richardson, and he helps bring these two together, puts them in conversation. In fact, Richardson uses Graham to convince Eisenhower to run for office. Sends him overseas to go meet with him. And so they become close friends. And it's an odd matchup. Truman, who took his faith very seriously, doesn't buy into Graham. Eisenhower, who again believes he's the most religious man he's ever met, but he doesn't belong to a church at the time. And he also didn't take really the teachings of his faith quite clear. The River Brethren are against smoking. He smokes 4 packs a day on D-Day. They're against the military. Obviously, he goes into a career there. But he finds in Graham a kindred spirit, someone who is preaching a lot of the broader things, not about faith, but about society that he believes in. They're both kindred spirits in this Christian libertarianism. We've forgotten that Graham starts out this way, but in the early 50s, he's known by a London paper as the big business evangelist. He tells a revival in Greensboro. The Garden of Eden will be a paradise with no labor leaders, no union dues, no snakes, and no disease. The kind of revival I'm calling for, he tells the Pittsburgh crowd, is one that calls for a worker to put in an 8-hour day. No good man would ever join a union to conspire against his employer, he says. Meanwhile, he speaks out time and time again for big business. He says the welfare state isn't needed. What we need is what he calls the return to the rugged individualism of Christ. This is not a phrase we often hear. But so he makes these arguments throughout, and he keeps on professing that he's nonpartisan, but he takes jabs at Truman throughout the campaign trail. And so when Eisenhower comes into office, Graham really comes with him and becomes a part of this public religion. He presides at, I think, the third National Prayer Breakfast. He's a constant presence. He maintains this role for Kennedy and Johnson, but it's Nixon where they really get tight. Nixon and Graham are as tight as any minister and president have ever been. His critics call him a Rasputin in the White House. He's a minister without portfolio, one refers to him. He's constantly there. He leads these church services. He does these public revivals for him on the trail. So, and he then backs off from this tight relationship with the president because he feels so burnt by Watergate. But before Watergate, they're very close.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested when you talk about a vague religion that could not be translated to the local level. However, it was very specific in its rituals. Would you say that or not? In terms of the kind of rituals that were developed around the Eisenhower White House?
At the national level, but the rituals are, again, kept very, very vague. And again, so what Rostow calls, Eugene Rostow calls ceremonial deism. Mm-hmm. By that he meant, obviously, deism, reflecting not just the founders' deism, but the fact that the references are always to God, or the Almighty, never to Jesus. The ceremonial part he meant, and that it was purely ornamental. I think ceremonies matter, and so that's why I like the term. But it was always kind of broad and vague, and everyone could be welcomed in. So Catholics, Jews, Protestants, they all find a way into this. Muslims, too. When Hawaii gets admitted to the Union, there are movements to make Buddhists feel welcome in this as well. I'm not sure how well they take. But everyone finds a way in, a place in that broad language. Again, when you get into the classroom, where you've got to decide, are we going to use the King James Version or not? Are we going to, which 10 Commandments are we going to, everyone agrees on the 10 Commandments until they try to actually write them out, and they realize Protestants, Catholics, and Jews disagree on the text. So once it goes down to that level of specificity, that broad consensus falls apart.
And I have one more, and I'm going to open it up so we can begin to talk about the Cold War. So you say that your you kind of look at it from another perspective and how you place the Cold War and all this. Talk a little bit more about that, because I find that really interesting.
Sure. Again, the traditional story here is one of kind of action and reaction. And I think this is where Graham's role really comes into play, because Graham's debut on the national scene in Los Angeles in late 1949 happens shortly after it's revealed that the Soviet Union has the atomic bomb. So the traditional story, if you read any of these books, is the Soviet Union got the bomb, America rediscovered God. It's kind of a simple 1-2. And certainly, there's a lot of talk about godless communism in the 50s. I'm not denying that that's there. But a lot of this talk, I think we're not reading it deeply enough. I found out this group Spiritual Mobilization, to give just one example. Publicly, they're talking about communism. Privately, they mean the New Deal state, that's creeping socialism as they see it. But say in their radio program, in the original scripts, they're all about Truman. They're denouncing Truman's programs, they're denouncing the Fair Deal, they're denouncing labor legislation. It's all domestic. Until their lawyer says, we're doing these shows as a public service. And if you get too specific about politics, we're going to lose that public service grant, and you're going to have to pay for the airtime. So do this instead, he says. Talk about a foreign example of communism abroad. And then you can make it clear in the end that we're facing the same kind of threat here. So that kind of, the Cold War becomes a stand-in for domestic politics, and I think a really convenient one in a lot of ways. And actually, and again, in Eisenhower's hand, as he uncouples it from this, from the partisan Christian libertarianism of those groups, and he unhooks it, he's able to bring in Democrats and liberals as well as Republicans and conservatives, and they all embrace this. I don't think you would have these wouldn't have passed Congress if they'd still had the sharp politics on them. By making the Cold War the enemy, the Soviet Union the enemy in the Cold War rather than the New Deal, you're able to get this kind of quick consensus.
It's very interesting. And just one last one. Mm-hmm. What, in the research that you did, what things were totally a surprise to you?
Oh, lots. This was a series of revelations for me. Again, the very idea that this mattered was something that I'd always been told wasn't true. The legal scholarship in this is that this doesn't matter. The original project was going to start in the early 60s. It's going to be a grassroots study of religious conservatives. And I started with school prayer. And I looked at Hugo Black's papers at the Library of Congress. And he's got 10 huge boxes of material, of letters sent in, mostly angry. And they're a delight to read, because Hugo Black could give as good as he got. There's one great example where a woman condemns him, and he writes her back and says, you should go to the library and ask for this book called the Bible. I'm sure you don't have it at home. And turn to the book of Matthew and see what it says about praying in public. But in the letters that come to him, hundreds, if not thousands, of references to "In God We Trust, One Nation Under God," challenging the Supreme Court justice on his understanding of church-state separation, and the one who had enshrined it in the Everson case, and pushing back. So I realized quickly that these matter. Another thing that surprised me was a later story I talk about, and it will probably make perfect sense to you all. It didn't fit with a kind of a culture wars frame that I'd gone in with, thinking about how these issues are debated today. But in the 1960s, there's a movement after the school prayer decision there to have a constitutional school prayer amendment to make that legal. And it's hugely popular. In the 1963-64 term, Congress receives more mail on that issue than anything else. This is the term when they're debating the Civil Rights Act, among other things. There's a lot on their plate. This is the issue the public cares about, and they're pushing hard for it. And what I found out as I dug into the hearings on this, and there are 2,774 pages of almost illegibly small print. They're deep. But as I dug into these, I found that it was religious leaders who led the opposition. So I got in with an assumption that the people who would be opposed to One Nation Under God would be atheist, would be secularist. Religious leaders lead the charge against this in the 60s. And it's because they reject a one-size-fits-all religion. They resent the state's usurpation of the role of teaching religion, of living it out. They don't like a kind of a watered-down faith. I call it a lowest common denomination of religion in the book. They don't want a one-size-fits-all faith. They really, they're Baptists because they believe in what Baptists believe. They're Lutherans because they believe that. And they want those particularities maintained. And so they push back strong. And it bewilders the congressmen who think that they're doing, that they're defending the church. And they're told quite literally, we don't need defending.
We don't want this. And that's what turns the tide. So it wasn't as simplistic as I think I naively assumed when I went in. It was much more complex. And so to see religious leaders pushing back against this public religion was really another revelation for me.
Fascinating. Are we ready for some questions? Yes. Yes, Serene, you can get us going.
This is building on Professor Machado's question about the Cold War. One of the things that strikes me is near the end of the war, it is very commonplace to see pictures of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin together. That they sort of are sharing a vision for what global life will look like on the other side of the war. And at the end of the war, you also have in the U.S. really growing support for socialism. Like there's a broad-based anticipation that this is the direction the United States is going to go. And I heard this past November I was at an event at the Truman Library. Actually, Bob Carey said that, and it's directly to your point, that the biggest turning point in the 20th century was the fact that Stalin decided to not just declare war on capitalism, but on religion as well. That they weren't necessarily coupled, but in Stalin, they were coupled. And then this, of course, set off in the United States a reaction to socialism because of that move, which seems to me feeds right into the kind of argument you're making about capitalist America being terrified at the growing popularity of the New Deal.
Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
So it's very opportunistic that this happens.
Yeah, I think it plays right. I don't think you have all this stuff realized in the early 50s without that backdrop. It both unites Americans, but it also unites these issues in their mind.
And so what about the Dulles brothers? Can you say a little bit about them?
Sure.
Lovely men that they
Lovely
were.
men that they are. I did a little work. I mean, John Foster Dulles' papers are at Princeton. I did a little work in them. Not a whole lot. There's a great book by Andrew Preston that deals with this. He's got a great chapter on Dulles, the Dulles brothers. But John Foster Dulles is, who's Secretary of State during the Eisenhower administration, is very much on board with this. And it's surprising. I thought conservative churchmen would embrace his appointment, but liberals do as well. Methodist Bishop Oxman sends him a really warm letter that he's excited about. They disagree on everything, but he's excited to have someone with religious faith in the State Department who's going to set an image for America abroad. And he brings that faith to the State Department. There are programs of prayers at State. He publishes a pamphlet I talk about called The Secretary of State on the Faith of Our Fathers that's given out throughout the State Department and published abroad. He's a leader of the Presbyterian Church. So he's, I think, much more aligned with a particular faith than Eisenhower ever was. But he brings that, he embraces that broad public religion on the job. He's able to kind of separate the two. The same with another one, Ezra Taft Benson, Secretary of Agriculture. He's one of the Council of 12 of the Church of Latter-day Saints. He brings his faith into agriculture. And so these massive departments in the government are led by people who are prominent lay leaders in these faiths. And whatever their difference is, they mobilize this large public religion in their offices. And a lot of money into it, yes.
That's right, you take the microphone so that we can. Yes, no. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I just wonder if you could say a little more about the opposition, religious opposition, to this idea of America as not only a Christian nation, but as capitalism being the expression of Christianity. As I recall, having lived through those years as a young man in Ohio, which was not particularly a revolutionary place to be, it seemed to me that for all of the sort of official identification of capitalism, Christianity, and America, what prevailed was really the opposition to that, which was, and then it grew strength with the civil rights movement, with Dr. King, with the whole critique of capitalism that came out of Christianity, but also before that, even with people like Niebuhr and Tillich and other who were on, Time Magazine and so on. I mean, there was a lot of opposition. So I wonder how you see the respective strengths of and how you evaluate the challenge to this notion.
Excellent question. There certainly are liberal figures in the church who speak out. Niebuhr does battle with Fifield and spiritual mobilization in the press. He denounces him constantly. He speaks out. He writes a great piece. What's it called? The King's Chapel and the King's Court, I think, in 1969, speaking out against Graham's involvement in the Nixon White House. So he's constantly pushing back. Robert McAfee Brown from Union speaks out strongly against a fellow group that I don't talk about in the book, but I researched, called the Christian Freedom Foundation, and they have this publication called Christian Economics. He rails after them piece after piece and kind of has them on the defensive, challenging this idea that they've wedded together. So they are making these cases. The problem is twofold. One, the politicians who you think would be sympathetic to this don't embrace them. So if you go back to the 30s, FDR is incredibly shrewd at using religious language, the language of the social gospel, to sell the welfare state. He's incredibly effective. His speeches from when he's even governor, he gives a great talk on, it's a dry talk on the privatization of public water utilities. And he says, I have a sermon today, and my message is, thou shalt not steal. I preach from the Old Testament, right? He goes on and on like that. His first inaugural address has so many religious references in it that the National Bible Reporter publishes a chart with the entire text and a series of lines and footnotes to all the different scripture that has been invoked. He calls out the money changers. In his second inaugural address, he likens himself to Moses, having led people out of the promised land. He's constantly invoking this language, and it's incredibly effective. In the 50s, the Democrats forget how to do this. So Niebuhr and a lot of other ministers, about 157 of them, put together a group, I think they call it Christian Alliance, and they want to send out statements on behalf of Adlai Stevenson that make this exact point, that this Eisenhower-type religion is empty, and instead what Christ wants is these kind of things the Democratic Party are advocating. We support him. Because Billy Graham was very obvious about he was supporting Eisenhower. And the Stevenson campaign says, no, we're not going to do that. I mean, they're inept across the board in their PR and advertising campaign, but on this one, they dropped the ball. The public also, though, pushes back against this. And it's more when this shifts, when it pivots from being this kind of Christianity and capitalism argument to this broad embrace of public religiosity that we see in the school prayer fight. You constantly see the leaders of mainline churches speak out against this in Congress. As I said, they turn the tide. What happens is, as they speak out against this, their rank and file revolts, and they're very upset with their leaders. It's evident across the board. Dulles and others had led this layman's group inside the Presbyterian Church that pushes back against the National Council of Churches. The Southern Baptists, though, are remarkable. Baptists have been traditionally the ones who were at the forefront of separation of church and state. I did research in the papers of Americans United. You find Baptists bragging about their role in founding this organization. They're incredibly proud of it and the work that it's doing. Again, they see it as keeping Catholics from getting public money, but they're very proud of this organization. By the 60s, though, as their representatives are making these arguments before Congress, they rebel against them. And so their belief in separation of church and state, which they had for centuries, suddenly they realize what it means in their day-to-day life, and they decide that they don't like it anymore. And so you start to see the conservative turn, a rebellion against them. It doesn't publicly manifest, I think, until the late 70s with the conservative takeover of the SBC, but the roots of it are here in the 60s. And so yes, liberal churchmen are making this argument, but the problem is that not a lot of politicians or lay people are as receptive to it as they otherwise would have been.
But
didn't they win in the end? I mean, you did keep the separation between church and state. I mean, I remember school prayer not being, victorious, but actually diminishing the ability, more and more arguments about the sort of whole development of sort of movements, Christian movements that were built on social justice. I mean, I don't know, it's something about the way you're presenting it which doesn't resonate with what I remember and live.
Well, on the issue of school prayer, the court rules. The problem is that a lot of people reject that ruling. There's resistance at the grassroots level. I mean, we remember George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door to defy segregation, but he says, I'll go to any school and read the Bible. There's a study that comes out in the late 70s that says, we don't have school prayer technically, but a lot of places we still do. And and there's a poll that came out in 2007. The First Amendment Center at Vanderbilt University did this, and it asked Americans, are we a Christian nation officially? 55% said yes. So, again, legally, they won the battle. Politically, they did not. And I think, you only have to look at the rise of the religious right over the 80s, 90s, and the last decade to see that the conflation of religion and politics has continued apace. And because it's a process where one thing builds upon another. So every president has a new innovation. Reagan adds "God bless America" to the end of every speech. We now take that for granted that a president does that. That was new. George H.W. Bush wraps himself almost literally in the flag and Pledge of Allegiance, leading crowds and saying that. These are things that had not happened before. So one example builds upon another, and it continues to snowball. And I think it's unimaginable that these things would be uprooted at this point. So in a way, yes, they won. Legally, school prayer is not allowed. But this conflation of love of God with love of country, I think, has only continued.
Yes. We have a question here, and then we'll go right. John? Go on.
So I'm curious about the voices of African American Christians in this period of time, okay? Especially as people for whom the state giveth and the state taketh away in the same moment, right? So how does the conflation of religion and politics look from their perspective?
That's a great question, Ainsley. I don't talk about this directly in the book, but I went in looking for race. And my first book was about segregationists, and I kind of went in with that in my mind. But I do think it factors in here, even though I don't talk about it in the book, because I think what this does is it sets up the successful protest of King and others. In linking Christianity and country together, it makes it much more effective for ministers to lead that movement. And so, and they're very, there's a reason ministers lead that campaign. Again, they make that argument for civil rights much more effectively because, again, to go back to your point, in the Cold War, it's not just that capitalism and Christianity get linked. Civil rights and communism get linked for the same reason. So the Soviet Union is against God, therefore we have to be godly. Well, the Soviet Union is in favor of racial integration. Therefore, any good American should be against it. And so that immediately becomes suspect as communist. So King and his leaders, there's a reason it's the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Southern, we're not outsiders. Christian, we're not communist. They very much play up that language. And so King invokes this stuff. He doesn't quite, I don't think, ever go with "In God we trust" or "One nation under God," but he invokes that language. And as he says in many of his speeches, all we're asking is for America to be true to what it says on paper. And so he's calling them to live up to that. So it's not a dodging of it, it's rather a repurposing of it for the civil rights cause.
Thank you for your remarks and for your book. We're here, at least many of us, because we want your best wisdom on how to overturn the current state of affairs. And so, not surprisingly, before you mentioned his name, I was looking in your index to see if Rauschenbusch was in your index, and Rauschenbusch was not in your index. And then you mentioned him just now. And not only did you mention him, but you say that the social gospel was in fact significant and did play a parallel but inverse role in Roosevelt's discourse. And then all you said was that that liberals just forgot how to do this. I mean, I'm wondering.
Political liberals.
Political liberals. Can you say a little bit more about
Sure.
that? And it sounds like you were saying that it is not impossible to articulate a social justice message in an American idiom. Not only in King's idiom, but even in a social gospel idiom of Roosevelt's sort.
Sure.
So this is actually a hopeful note that you're
Oh,
saying
good. I
for,
don't mean to press
you know,
people. This is nice.
So, what we need to learn is to learn from you how to figure out how to mobilize this discourse again. Now, of course, there's also a worry. If merely mirroring theological discourse wedded to statist discourse on a progressive end is, there are problems with
Sure.
thinking that
Sure.
ought to be the way we move too, because then there's still a kind of too close a kind of comfort. So I'm wondering what your best advice would be for us, particularly in light of your comments on Rauschenbusch and Roosevelt.
Well, I think it's to remember, as you know, that this was possible. This did happen. The leaders of the Federal Council of Churches come out when Roosevelt unveils the New Deal, and they say, this is good. This embraces basic Christian principles, such as the importance of daily bread and shelter and security. These are things that we believe in. And it's certainly, it's out there again now. I think you only have to look at the contrast between how John Kerry ran and how Barack Obama ran to see how this works. John Kerry in 2004, the campaign, it looked like Adlai Stevenson's campaign. They had no clue what they were doing on religious outreach. They wrote off religious voters, assumed that they were part of the Bush coalition, and they could never reach, that there even was such a thing as liberal religious people out there. They handed off to I think a 24-year-old staffer who has no contacts, not even a Rolodex of names to reach out to. The journalist Amy Sullivan had a great line I use in the book about how it wasn't just David versus Goliath, it was David versus Goliath and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and on and on. Obama doesn't cede that ground. And so think about, again, the same campaign, 2004, when Obama makes his the speech that I think propelled him to national consciousness. He talks about, we are our brother's keeper. We are our sister's keeper. That's a broad religious language. In blue states, we believe in an awesome God. He speaks in the language that evangelicals would know. He formed alliances, reaching out. He talked at Saddleback. He found there are evangelicals who care about the environment. There are evangelicals who care about social justice, who are opposed to wars. He knew that was something out there that could be done. So it's possible. I think it's just that the political leaders have to decide that that's an audience that they want to speak to. The trick for Democrats, I think, and again, I'm an historian, I'm way off base here in terms of talking about the president of the future, but if I had to hazard a guess, I think they've got to find a way to walk that line with their coalition, because there are people for whom, there are secularists, atheists on the Democratic side for whom any mention of religion is going to repulse them. So they've got to walk the line that Obama did when he said we are a nation of believers and non-believers. So it's a new level of inclusiveness, of thinking about the way in which this works. And he caught a lot of flack from the right for that Obama has said we're no longer a nation under God, on and on. That audience is never going to vote for him, right? Or probably any Democrat. But to pitch a language that makes it a safe space for believers and non-believers alike, and to reach those believers and show them that their religious faith can be put into action with this sort of politics, I think that might be a way forward.
Do we have someone else?
Well, there is no more quick.
Okay.
Again, work in prognostication for a historian.
Okay. Yep. Always dangerous.
The religious landscape now lists persons with no affiliation as, I think, the largest demographic category.
Yep.
My intuition is that this radically changes the game, and that there are probably generational issues
Absolutely.
at play here, with young people also perhaps increasingly checking no affiliation. Of course, we don't really know much about what people mean when they say no affiliation.
Right.
Maybe it means that they would like to check more than one. Maybe it means that they're, SBNR, spiritual but not religious. But how do you see this entire network of issues that you're exploring in this book permutating under the force of this new growing segment of the American electorate?
It's a great question. I think one of the key to understanding it is going to be is, you're right, it is the millennials who are this younger generation who are the most likely to check no affiliation. And if we assume that most of them really mean they're not religious at all, not even spiritual, not religious, but just not, what an early generation would have called secularists, does it maintain? As they get older, as they have kids, as they get married, do they stay that way? Traditionally, some fall back into the face of their parents at that point, perhaps. But if it holds, I mean, then I think demographically we're looking at a major shift. It'll still be a while until it's a difference to say that that's the largest single group to that being a majority of all voters. And until it reaches that point, I don't think you would see any significant change. In fact, it would have to be pretty large. I'm thinking of the change on social issues here, like gay rights or marijuana legalization. If you poll the public on do they support this, large majorities, are politicians moving on this? They're just starting to. I mean, they've got to have a lot of safe ground. So to roll this back, I think you're going to have huge majorities that are calling for this. Because when these things happen, they're very easy to enact. When under God is added to the Pledge of Allegiance, Christian Century says, well, no politician's going to vote against this. It'd be like voting against motherhood, right? And so it's an easy thing to happen. Once it happens, though, it's very hard to undo it. And so it's going to take, I think, large majorities of those voters, not only saying that to polls, but saying that to politicians, that we want this removed before it would ever change. So I think we're a bit off from that.
So I have another question to also jump in on this. So it's a two-part question. One is, so you describe the kind of rugged individualism of Eisenhower and Jesus, which is such a far cry from the ability to imagine that a corporation could be a person.
Right.
So it's almost the opposite of that. And yet we find the religious right that was created by that language to be most closely tracking the notion of a corporation as a person. So if you could say
Sure.
something about that, but then also tied to that, the understanding of religious freedom that has to do with the freedom of the individual to practice. Now moving, I think, is the new battleground in which we're going to have to see the collusion between corporate interest and religious interest in this country and how it's going to be fought. So can you sort of, those two tracks into this conversation?
Sure, big questions. Let me see if I get into them. There is in the 50s, this, it's in, classic, the book's out answer. It was in part that got cut. I had a discussion about the role in the 50s of what goes on with corporate leaders and the National Association of Manufacturers with this religious language. And they hold a conference in 1958 where they bring together a variety of religious leaders, and it's chaired by Edwin L.R. Elson, who's the head at National Presbyterian. He's Eisenhower's pastor. And at the end of this conference, he makes a pronouncement summing up what they've discovered through all their discussions about the role of religion in corporate America. And he says, we've discovered something here. We've discovered the corporation has a soul. Yeah. So he makes this pronouncement in 58.
Wow.
It's not one that the courts recognized until quite recently, but the seed of it is out there. And the politics that are behind that statement, I think, again, go back to that early Christian libertarian movement in the 30s, where you basically have preachers making an argument that religious liberty trumps the regulatory state, and if you have sincere religious beliefs, you should be exempt from that argument, from their oversight. Again, the courts don't buy it in the 30s, but it's very prevalent. Another question was about religious liberty. I'm sorry, could you reframe it for me?
In terms of the relationship between the corporation and now this sort of conflation of corporations as people, corporations being the upholders of religious
fracturing a little bit. I just read a great piece by Mark Silk in which he talks about what he calls spiritual libertarianism, which is distinct from what I talk about, which is Christian libertarianism. Will confuse you. In my book, it's free market arguments being made with religious language. He's talking about a new development, which is libertarians positioning themselves as the defender of religious liberty. And it has an economic context in the Hobby Lobby case. But you are starting to see that out there in the Hobby Lobby case on one side. But at the same time, we're seeing a pushback against this from other corporations, and some that are surprising. So to see, as a Southerner, to see NASCAR speak out against the Indiana law was a little surprising. To see Walmart, you talk about a company that is deeply invested with a religious identity from its founders, to speak out against that law. And I think here what matters is that the climate has changed. And so arguments that they would have readily made in the 70s or 80s or even 90s, they now see what the public